Let's go ahead and call the committee to order. Clerk will take a silent roll in order to ascertain the presence of a quorum. The August meetings are in your packet for approval. Recognize the Vice Chair for a motion.
Chairman, I move the approval of the minutes from the previous meeting.
Motion's been made. All those in favor? Opposed? All right, minutes are approved. Our first presentation this afternoon is from a senior fellow at the Foundation for Government Accountability, Josh Archambault. So I've got the name right. And this presentation will we'll entertain questions at the end of it as we're going through it. But it's for government accountability and transparency, and they've made this presentation in other states. This will be a vital component of our mission here to run state government as efficiently as possible. So turn the podium over to you, Mr. Archambault.
I'm building up the anticipation here.
That's a ritual for this committee, right?
Certainly helps knowing where the on switch is. Well, thank you all so much. I'm just a real pleasure to be here back in West Virginia and share some thoughts, and just very briefly wanted to give you a sense who FGA is and who I am. FGA has been around for about 5 years now. We're a think tank, and we are a national group, really in a niche where we are working in the health and welfare space only at the state level. So we're active in about 27 or 28 states at this point, and our goal is to be a resource for you all as you're trying to figure out how to get your hands around or to tweak or implement best practices, particularly in the health and welfare space, which are often driving some of the budget issues that you're running into, but also has to do with accountability and how you're spending taxpayer money. So just give you a brief overview. Here's where we're headed today. I'm going to walk you through three things. Why work matters so much on your welfare programs, how anti-fraud initiatives or extra verification can be helpful in that, and ultimately start some discussion around protecting resources for the truly needy, because this is really what this is about, making sure that you have the resources for those individuals that as a society we have committed to help and assist going forward. So I will break probably 3 separate times. If people have questions, I'm happy to take them, unless the chairman prefers that I wait till the very end. But so imagine with me for just one moment, what was your first job that you got paid for paid work? For me, I can remember it vividly. I had a crisp $20 bill in my hands after wrestling with a lawnmower for over 2 hours on a quite sizable plot of land in New Hampshire, covered in dust. And I felt so good about that work. It left me satisfied but wanting more. Probably many of you shared that experience. Unfortunately, many of our welfare programs undercut that very sense of accomplishment. And that's what I want to start with here. Now, this year marked the 20th anniversary of welfare reform in this country, and many people, commenters on the right and left, said that it has been a great success for the TANF population, the cash assistance program in this country. And one of the key components of that was a work requirement. Now, what most folks don't realize is that on the food stamp program, there was also a provision in the welfare reform bill having to do with able-bodied adults without dependents. So these are 18 to 49-year-olds, they don't have a disability, they're working age, no kids. Well, unfortunately, West Virginia has the distinction among a handful of others that has been waiving that work requirement for that population for the last few years. Look, I've seen the personal impact of these decisions for my own sister and my family. For her, after many life changes and decisions, the biggest thing that made a difference for her was a job. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want our welfare programs to be paying people not to work? Now, today I'm going to share with you a first-of-its-kind study that FGA was involved in one of these states that reinstated its work requirement. It's been duplicated now in other states as they have started to reinforce a work requirement for this able-bodied population. I'm going to start with the conclusion. So we tracked 41,000 able-bodied adults without dependents in the state of Kansas, and this was the end result. They found employment in 650 different industries across the state, and incomes doubled. Really, what we want in terms of progress for welfare reform. We had 3.5 years of data, and we were able to match Department of Labor data with the welfare enrollee information, so we could see things like where they were getting employment, how quickly they were able to get employment, how much they were getting paid, how long they had been on the program, basically to chart the impact of the policy reform. Now, why does this all matter? This was one story that stuck with me as we did the analysis. This is a gentleman that lived just outside of Kansas City. He had been on the welfare program for 4 years with no earned income. I mean, that's quite remarkable. So as the economy at the time was improving, his life wasn't. He was stuck. Yet within 3 months of reinstating the work requirement, he had found employment in the publishing industry and he's making $45,000. Now, this is just one example of the life-changing effect of this. We literally had thousands of these stories that we were able to pull out of the data in all these sorts of different industries. So before the reform, only 1 in 5 was working on the food stamp program. They reinstate the work requirement, half go back to work immediately. Within 12 months, 60% are working. It's the direction that we want to head as far as the positive outcome. Even those that remained on food stamps due to the work requirement saw a significant increase in the amount of work that they were doing. The fastest growth happened in the group of individuals working 20 hours or more, which is really encouraging. That's one of the stepping stones for getting folks self-sufficient again. Now, lest we think that all of these folks were getting jobs in fast food or in retail, might be a little bit hard to see here, I apologize. But like I mentioned, 650 different industries where they were finding employment. And we were able to see some really interesting trends that have really fundamentally changed the way that these programs are administered. The first one is that a lot of individuals got their first foot onto the economic ladder through a temp agency. But we were able to track within a quarter or two they were moving into permanent employment. That certainly would influence how you design your workforce or employment opportunities through the state. The other reason I include this chart is the agencies that are doing this have realized that now they have almost a real-time basis to see who's hiring and where in the state. It's not we wish people were hiring in this area. They actually can counsel the remaining enrollees where there are opportunities or where there may not be. They're able to redesign those employment programs to say, given your skill set and those that are hiring, you need to go get this education if you want employment in this area. Fundamentally different from just refilling food stamp cards. Here's a little bit about the change in income. Average wages are now above the poverty line. That's remarkable in an area of welfare reform that for years has had failed experiments over and over again. Now, nobody will say this is the end of the line. The data has continued to get better in a few of the states that have done this from quarter to quarter as people are more mature in their job. They're choosing to change jobs and earn a little bit more income, but this is true progress. Now, what we have seen in a number of states as they've re-implemented a work requirement is a significant reduction in the enrollment for folks on the program. Now, what this means at a high level is 3 out of 4 folks decided to cycle off the program. The program still remained there though for the one that really needed it, with no time limit as long as they meet the work requirement. If we want a successful safety net, we want a few different outcomes for what that looks like. And it means shorter periods of time that our individuals are on this program. We've seen the amount of time people spending on food stamps cut in half as a result of reinstating the work requirement. There's a lot more work activity happening with rising incomes, which is ultimately leading to this freedom from poverty. Now, for those that left the program, they're making far more than they lost in benefits. They're coming out ahead. So I am here to encourage you to think deeply about the current policies in West Virginia, in which only 9 counties have a work requirement starting this year. Think about the rest of the state. The other contrast I want to give you is with your TANF program. Think about this. You have a single mother with kids who on the TANF program we asked to work 30 hours. But yet an able-bodied adult with no disability and no kids we're waiving the work requirement for. And I want to be really, really clear about this. Work requirement perhaps is not the right phrase. Certainly they can meet the work requirement by working, but they also can be volunteering. They can be in an educational program. They can be watching somebody else's dependent person that can be in rehab. There are many ways to meet this requirement that are built into the system and designed so that people can re-enter the workforce and be ready to re-enter the workforce instead of just being paid not to work. So I want to pause for a moment and see if any members have any particular questions about this policy issue.
Yeah, I think thank you. That's remarkable material. Are there questions related to the presentation that we've had to this point? Delegate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that I heard you say that was interesting to me is, I have actually had constituents and actually been in the situation myself where it almost seems like it makes more sense to be on some type of a program than to work. And you made the statement that it doesn't take very long for people to actually earn more than what they are losing in benefits. Can you expand on that a little bit? I know one of the things that I've dealt with myself is the Affordable Care Act. If you make less than $40,000 in certain circumstances, you get 100% coverage, but if you've got to buy your health insurance, then it costs a lot to do that. So it almost makes more sense not to work. So, and that's just one example, but I'm just looking for expansion of how much does a person have to make in order to overcome that benefit loss, I guess.
So you're raising a very important point, and I do want to recognize that there are income cliffs here, and unfortunately they're built into a lot of these programs. I would recommend you reach out to your federal partners to address those, but I do want to highlight that I think our work points out two things. The first one is that in this reform in particular, people tend to just blow over the income cliff. It's not preventing a lot of them from going over. A lot of them are just re-entering the workforce, and pretty quickly they're making more money than they have lost in benefits. So in the food stamp example in particular, I don't want to lose focus there because people they make the jump and average wages are above the poverty line. Now the cutoff here for food stamps is 130% of the federal poverty level. So again, where you're gonna get that income cliff is right around. So the dynamic of picking up a couple extra hours or an extra shift, that's where it would come in. But in a large case, remember, only 1 in 5 were working before. So the big change is just simply starting to work, and that's what blows you over the income cliff. And it's not even a consideration for the vast majority of these folks. But I don't want to downplay it, because for certain enrollees, it certainly is a calculation. I've talked to individuals myself who are doing the math in their head to trying to figure it out. So I don't want to say it's not an issue, but in this case, for the vast majority of people, it simply isn't their consideration.
Further questions? Yes, Senator Palumbo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You focus a lot on Kansas, and I see in your written materials, Maine has also done something similar. Are there other states, or are those the only two that have gone down this road?
So they're the only two that have done the comprehensive study, and we have the best data from. But no, they're not the only ones. We've seen, I think it was 23 states move this last summer in reinstating work requirements. 17 of them went statewide, even though they economically still qualified, many of them, for waivers. They decided that, no, this is the policy direction that we want to head. I think there's a number of considerations there. One, for some people it's philosophical. For another, there's actually an economic reason here. So we were able to estimate roughly how much additional economic activity was generated by this change. If we were to see similar levels here in West Virginia, we project $87 million of additional economic activity related to earnings. These people, again, are making more money. They're going out and spending more money than they were on the food stamp benefits. That would translate into probably $3 million of additional income revenue here in the state. So I think for a lot of individuals, once they started to hear that element, that they saved in administrative costs because now they have a lot fewer people to be working with. They saw more local revenue or state revenue generated as a result of this. For them, that was enough for them to push. They just haven't done the deep dive study. We have about 5 other states that are somewhere in the process of doing this study, but I don't have the results, unfortunately, to present this morning.
But you said about 23 have done it in some form or fashion, so about half the states have implemented some type of work requirement.
Yes, they've reinstated more work requirements than they had the last year.
And did I hear you mention that 9 counties in West Virginia have a work requirement?
Yes, so the department moved towards 9 counties reinstating a work requirement.
Okay. Do you know which ones have those?
I do, and I'm happy to give them to you afterwards if you want the list.
Yeah. Do you have them in front of you right now?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead and share those, and then we'll get staff to make copy and distribute it. But go ahead if you don't mind.
Happy to, and I'll embarrass myself in the process by I'm sure pronouncing half of them wrong. Berkeley, Cabell, Harrison, Jefferson, here locally, Marion, Monongalia, Morgan, and Putnam counties.
Do we have any data from that, from those counties?
Yeah, they just started. I'm unaware of any, although we've talked to the department a little bit about it. But.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from the committee? All right, if you could proceed to the
Sure,
next
happy to.
element of your presentation.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk some about the anti-fraud and verification. And to do that, I think the best way is just to show a brief video here.
Hi, my name is Christine Chalky. I live in Streator, Illinois with my husband and my 3 boys. One of my boys was born with a very rare developmental disability. We call him our miracle child because he survived and outbeat the odds.
Jacob Alvin, I'm Chalky, and I am 19 years old.
Jake has life-threatening seizure disorder, so he has only one particular medicine that will stop his seizures from happening. When Jake was born and diagnosed at age 6 months, we were basically told that a very grim prognosis.
Because his doctor, he never thought I'd walk, talk.
And then at about age 22 months, he developed seizures, and they told us the seizures would be his downfall.
It's like hitting a brick wall. Sometimes I almost want to cry, but you know, as I know with us guys, we don't try to cry as much.
So Jake is a miracle child to us because he's outbeat all the odds, outbeat the predictions, and with the other 18 children that there are in the world, Jake is doing the best out of those 18, and he is the oldest living survivor. Welfare fraud means people abusing and using the system to benefit and taking away from the most vulnerable and the neediest of all. It upsets me, it saddens me, not just for Jake, for the other people too that I know that are probably out there too, but don't have the ability to speak or represent themselves.
To the people who think that welfare fraud is not a problem, I would say they are not living in reality. These are benefits that the taxpayers of this country have put monies aside to ensure that people that really need help get the help they need.
You're taking away the services and the quality and the access to good health care for that most fragile population that really needs that.
People with developmental disabilities are on waiting lists, need medicine, some are homeless, needing food, shelter, clothing, the basics in life. They're in emergency situations and they can't get off the list because there isn't enough supposed money to serve them.
Clearly, this is a problem across the country.
This, throughout the United States, is one of the #1 issues in the budget of every state legislature, but a lot of people had not addressed it. And in Illinois, we had not addressed it.
This initiative auditing, making sure that welfare programs are being handed out to those that are truly eligible, is really a way of making sure that the program is sustainable long-term for those that truly need it.
This audit reform was the key, the cornerstone of our entire Medicaid reform project. There were close to 3 million people on Medicaid. We probably had close to 350,000 people who should not be there in the system, and that was costing $350 million. And I had no qualms in addressing all the other legislators as to, I think, what the outcome would be, that it would be favorable for everybody in the state of Illinois, that the Medicaid population would get more services, better access, and quality health care. We would save money for the state.
Because at the end of the day, we have to make sure that benefits that are there for those that are truly needy and depend on them are there and are sustainable long term. And we all want that person or persons that are receiving welfare to become independent and self-sufficient. That's the goal.
As we get Jake more independent, he will cost less in the long run.
I really want to get a job because I really do not like being home a lot. It's to me really boring, so I'm also hoping to someday be a self-advocate to speak out for kids with brain malformation disabilities.
This has no party label to it. This is about principle. It's about making sure that these benefits are there for those that are truly eligible and that they're sustainable.
There's no excuse. There's no excuse for 300,000 sitting on the Medicaid system that should not have been using the funds.
If states do not get welfare fraud under control, they will find over time that the benefits may not be there for those that are truly eligible.
Why would you not want to save money, help the most vulnerable, and help society and taxpayers as a whole?
So a brief update on Jake. He does have a job now. He is working 3 days a week, so since this video was made. So imagine if in your state you could tell when somebody's applying for benefits if they're in fact eligible. And then imagine if you could on a more regular basis monitor if they're still eligible throughout the year. Now, unfortunately, our programs do not do that now. For instance, on the Medicaid program, you're only redetermining eligibility once a year. But people's lives change. They get married, they move out of state, they die. But unfortunately, unless that's self-reported, that information is not known to the department. And in the case of Medicaid, you're continuing to pay perhaps a managed care company for their care, even when that individual no longer qualifies. So, this really came to a head a couple years ago when the federal government granted to 36 states, including West Virginia, the ability to stop doing redeterminations for Medicaid. Now, this has started again, but I think it highlights two pieces that is part of this initiative. The first one is the frequency by which you check really matters, and what you check really matters. We have seen this program implemented, or elements of it implemented, in a number of different states. The video mentioned Illinois and some of its early results, but there are a number of other states that have done this more recently. This is from Arkansas. They ran a pilot here. They found almost 500 dead enrollees on their program, 43,000 individuals who are living out of state, 7,000 of them who had never lived in the state. The only record of them in the state of Arkansas was being on their Medicaid program, and they found all these examples. There were some red flags about individuals, about perhaps how much assets or their other resources they might have had for being on the program. They also found 20,000 enrollees that had high-risk Social Security numbers. So either Social Security numbers associated with somebody else, Social Security number associated before that person was actually born, or other issues like that. Now, I think what's really key here is that this is a proven but not prevalent reform. The state of Pennsylvania used to do something similar to this. It's been largely scrapped under the current administration. But even just reporting among state agencies of data that you currently have at your fingertips, making sure that your eligibility staff has those and are cross-checking them frequently. If somebody wins the lottery or has a gaming winning, are you cross-checking that on a regular basis to your welfare enrollees? Are you checking the death registry frequently so that you don't continue to pay for somebody who's passed away? And as I mentioned, there are many reasons why the department, we've had some conversations with the department about this. There is, I think, a new eligibility system eventually will come online. We don't really have many details about it, but I will say that in the other states that have modernized their eligibility systems, there's a couple things that we have raised. One, they typically are not accessing this data, the 21st century data tools that are out there. I'm not talking about a new IT system. Nobody's interested in paying for that. I'm simply talking about access to data that tells you when somebody's moved out of state. We all know the credit agencies and others that are data vendors in this space, and making sure that you have access to those tools are so important to not only take care of taxpayer dollars, but also make sure that these programs are sustainable long term. And ultimately, we have to remember why these are so important. It's for folks like Jake, so that we can see that the $160 million saved in 10 months in Pennsylvania translated into them being able to do more of, rehab beds or mental health or filling a budget hole that might exist in a certain state. And that's ultimately why we push these. Any questions on this before I go on to the kind of third segment I wanted to talk about?
Questions from the committee regarding, yes, Senator, or Delegate Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you found instances where departments get some kind of benefit themselves for enrolling people? Do they have incentive, in other words, to keep people on the rolls? Is that maybe part of this?
So it depends a little bit on the program, but on the Medicaid program in particular, the biggest issue has been just the way that the program is established with how much federal dollars versus state dollars. So if a state finds somebody to be fraudulent and removes them, the federal government benefits more than the state does in the Medicaid program. So I think that's really hindered some of the anti-fraud efforts over the years. I think that dynamic is changing for two reasons. The first one, out of pure necessity. Medicaid is Pac-Manning state budgets, and you simply have to try to get a handle on some of that out-of-control cost because it's crowding out education spending, it's crowding out public safety, and so I think that the urgency is certainly changing. I think the other thing is some of the tools that are available in the private sector are a lot more sophisticated, can be used a lot more cheaply and automated in many cases, and so as a result, it's a much easier lift to be able to do some of what I'm describing here than previously when it was a manual process or the state didn't have access to data from surrounding states, for instance.
Okay, so if we as a state, and which is often the case with Medicaid and others, we're getting a 3-to-1 match or something like that, and we find that there is someone receiving benefits who has passed away or is not entitled to them, do you find that the checks are still written to someone in that household where the checks are cashed, or is the state in some way keeping that money?
Again, depends on the program, on the funding streams. On the Medicaid side, you would get to keep the savings, right, if somebody is removed from the program. We have seen instances in other states where, on food stamps in particular, it would be written to somebody else. We recommend kind of tiers here. The first one is get a little bit more sophisticated on the first end when somebody comes in, making sure they're eligible. Then look for the low-hanging fruit. And if you're ready for phase 2, then we can talk about everyone in the household, making sure that they are qualified. Most states don't have any idea if somebody's living in the household who previously committed welfare fraud, as an example. That's a phase 2 reform where you're making sure that there's nobody in the household that actually has a history of abusing the program. So there's a couple layers to it. It depends on the program. Happy to chat with you a little bit more after if you have more detailed questions.
Okay, final question along that line then, is it expensive to do what you're suggesting that we do here, actually screen a little bit more closely as we go?
So in our experience, the return on investment's been about 10-to-1 for this particular reform, so it's been pretty good. What I will say that there are vendors that this is a new line of business for them, kind of providing the data. And so they're willing, in many cases, to do a free proof of concept to show you the value of what they do before you actually start paying them. We highly recommend, and just to be very clear, we don't have any financial relationship with any of the data vendors or anything like that, but we highly recommend that you put them at risk so that you only pay them when you actually save money in a contract, and that you only pay them per applicant not per application, because you want to make sure that you're not paying them for duplicative applications. So there's a couple of different ways that you structure these things, but the results have been so good in other states. In fact, in Illinois, they started in the Medicaid program, and the new governor has now expanded it into the TANF program, is expanding it into a few of the other means-tested welfare programs that they have out there, because they've been so happy with the results so far.
Okay, good information on that. And then sort of on a little bit different note, I've heard reports of drug dealers being arrested and having, tons of cash, from their dealings evidently, but also having stacks of EBT cards. Evidently, they're buying those cards or they're getting the cards in trade for something. And so I'm wondering, do you know what happens, in the case in West Virginia, if a person loses their card, are they just issued another one, and then does that prevent someone who maybe has the lost card from using it?
So we'll get there in a couple slides, but the short answer is this is a problem. It's a serious problem of trafficking of EBT cards, especially in the drug area. Unfortunately, there's not a lot that you can do, but typically what happens is somebody can then call in and ask for a replacement card. What should happen is the old card should be deactivated. But sometimes that doesn't always happen immediately, and there is a sense that you could trade your card. It could be utilized for drugs or cash, and then you could go utilize it and then ask for a replacement card. The federal government, to their credit, has finally started to wake up to this problem, and they have now asked states that I think after the 5th request for a replacement card, you're supposed to send a letter to an individual saying, hey, we've noticed a high level of requests. And the data that we've seen from across the country does actually make a pretty big difference. There's usually about a 75 to 80% drop in repeat requests after that. So I don't think it's a silver bullet answer, but it starts to address some of the concerns that you're raising.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Further questions? Senator Palumbo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you say the return on investment when you engage one of these outside vendors who help with this is 10 to 1, is that 10 overall government dollars to 1, or are you talking about 10 state dollars to 1?
It's typically, again, it depends on the state, because Illinois has a different match rate, right, for its Medicaid program. So in their case, the 10 to 1 was state dollars, but they're closer to a 50-50 split. We've calculated, given the current match rate for you all, you'd be looking at somewhere around probably $20 million in savings in state dollars going forward, based on the experience that we've seen in other states. Now, I want to be clear that the department is moving with some sort of new system, and it's unclear exactly what that system is going to do. So before we would like to put pen to paper on that $20 million, I think you'd need to ask a number of questions of the department about what their new system is going to look like. What are they going to be doing differently than they've done in the past? You are unique in one way in that you have an integrated eligibility system. Not every other state has that. And that could lead to a slightly different outcome than in some other states, but we need to have some more information before determining that.
Well, with that being said about, eliminating fraud and getting people off the rolls who shouldn't be on there and saving money, why have states like Pennsylvania gone away from this?
It's a good question that you should ask the governor there. I think largely it was just a difference in priorities. The previous administration was really focused on fighting fraud and containing the budget impact. The current administration there does not seem as interested.
Okay, I'm assuming they must dispute the return on investment that you're saying is available for them. Do you know what their numbers showed as far as how much money it cost them to look out for this and how much they saved?
They saved $160 million in the first 10 months. And they didn't hire additional staff for what they did. So again, I think you're going to have to ask the current administration. Again, it's about priorities. You all understand this. And the current governor there has staked the position in a direction that he would like to head, and that simply is a different one than what they were doing in the past.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Further questions? This segment of the presentation? Continue. You have 3 components, and this.
Yeah, this is the last one.
Oh well, listen, it's
last
great
one
information.
and shortest
Well,
of the 3. So I wanted to just highlight a couple other promising best practices that we've seen from around the country. One is slightly related to this. It's a different variation of it. There's a national pilot going on called the National Accuracy Clearinghouse, NAC for short. Mississippi is the host state. And right now it's only in the 5 southeastern states. And what it's looking for is dual enrollment on food stamps. So is John Smith on our program as well as somebody else's? Or when John Smith moves, how do we make sure that he's not on both programs if he doesn't self-report that move? The early results of that have come back, and they are quite good from my perspective. You have cases where Georgia and Florida are now saving $200,000 a month as a result, and the remainder of the states have saved about $100,000 a month as a result of this, just for food stamps in those 5 states. So there's a couple things to think about. The first one is there's discussions about this program going national so that more states can participate in it. There's also discussions about making this program more robust, beyond food stamps, for Medicaid, for child support payments, for TANF, to make sure that individuals are only on one program. The most egregious examples in the NAC project was people who were on food stamps in all 5 of the southeastern states. That's questionable. But there's other ramifications for this, because many times when people are on your food stamp programs, they're also on your Medicaid program. So you have a state budget impact there that you really want to think through and make sure that if somebody's no longer qualified, they're removed from the program. There's also a movement in a couple of different states to actually try to understand how your benefits are being utilized. And I wanted to just share this brief illustration. This is a meat vendor or store, if you will, a merchant in a tiny, tiny rural Georgia town, population of 500, I think it was. And what happened was a frontline staffer was going to an event in the area, and as the department does occasionally, decided to pick randomly a vendor and go visit. So she went out to her event, she stopped into this facility, and something just didn't quite look right. This is what she found. So after she returned back to the office, she actually started to dig a little bit deeper. And what she found was $1 million of food stamp transactions at this tiny little facility. And then she started to dig a little bit deeper and said, well, where are all these people coming from? People were driving 60, 80, 100 miles to get to this facility. They were buying $300 of bacon a month. And some of them were reporting to be homeless, but yet spending all of their food stamp money on meat, which raises some questions about where you'd store it. But what the end result was, they ended up removing almost 2,000 enrollees, and over a number of years, they figured out that there had been $4.7 million in fraud. So you all are pretty smart. You probably connected the dots. People were selling their benefits for cash, about 75 cents on the dollar. It was out of pure luck that they found this example. And so a number of states have tried to get a lot more sophisticated about looking at the trends by which people are having transactions. Certain states have really nailed down all the transactions between midnight and 4 a.m., for instance. High dollar amounts, even dollar amounts. This is data from the state of Maine. This is right around in Orlando. $3.5 million of transactions in Florida from the state of Maine of their food stamp program, largely concentrated in Orlando and Fort Lauderdale. And so, of course, they had some follow-up to do with some individuals about why were they using their cards for 2-3 straight months out of state exclusively in Florida. Now, locally here, you all have had a little snapshot of this. Delegate Upson has last year got some data on looking at some of where West Virginia's food stamp and TANF benefits have been accessed. And it raises some of these similar issues. $1 million last year in Florida alone. Hawaii, U.S. Virgin Islands. Now, to be fair, there could be legitimate reasons for some of these transactions, but there could also be illegitimate reasons why these transactions are happening. And so as a state, you want to make sure that you're following up on these. As a result of Maine's efforts, they've seen a 40% reduction in out-of-state spending. Now, you can't limit where somebody uses their food stamps due to federal regulations, but you certainly can track it. And I think what's been deeply troubling in a number of states has been, to your point, a number of states that are dealing with the opioid crisis have found that food stamps seems to be fueling them, because once you take a little bit closer look at where a lot of these transactions are happening, they're happening in corridors that are known corridors for where drugs are coming into the state. it's hard to get rid of this problem, but at least minimally looking at the issue and doing your best of trying to understand the trends and then working with law enforcement to understand the activities in certain areas is worth the effort, both from a welfare reform perspective, but also from a public health perspective going forward. So before I close, I just wanted to highlight a couple other areas that you may want to consider going forward. Currently on the food stamp program, West Virginia has no asset test. So somebody could have $100,000 sitting in a bank account and still qualify for your program. And we've seen egregious examples all over the country of this. And some of those egregious examples led Maine and Michigan most recently to reinstate their asset tests because they had lottery winners winning $4 million. And the month they took the payout, they weren't qualified, but the very next month they were, still on their welfare program. So we would strongly recommend that you consider reinstating some sort of asset test to make sure that these programs are reserved for the truly needy. Now, just to note, there are exemptions, housing and retirement accounts also doesn't count as an asset test. So I just want to be very clear that what we're talking about here. Finally, I just wanted to mention child support cooperation. We, in the research, on top of just what we've done, has shown that child support is one of the most effective fighters of child poverty. Unfortunately, in most states, the payment rate for child support is abysmally low. But states do have the option to say to certain enrollees that if you're not current in this program, then we're going to put on hold this program. So in this example, you could say to an individual, if you need to pay child support, until you are current on those child support payments, you're not going to be able to access food stamps. We've just recently, in the past 2 weeks, gotten some data back from a state that reinstated this policy, and they saw an enormous spike in compliance with paying child support. This is a win-win-win going forward for the low-income parent who is taking care of the child, but certainly for the child's future when it comes to pulling them out of poverty. So I just wanted to mention that as a possibility as you go forward. So I've given you a lot to think about. I really appreciate the opportunity to highlight a number of these best practices that we've seen across the country, and I hope you give them due consideration going forward.
Thank you. Fantastic presentation. This is the kind of thing that this committee is chartered to do, is to have efficient use of taxpayers' money as a steward of our taxpayer dollars. So we're going to open it up for, please stay at the podium. We'll open it up for some additional questions and spend a little time with that. Senator Blair, do you have a question?
I didn't hear you mention anything about it on the card, but I've had constituents say to me before that they felt that a photo being on there would solve a lot of problems. You want to elaborate or say that you can't do that, or give me an insight onto that?
Sure. So you absolutely can put a photo on an EBT card. The federal government will fight you tooth and nail through that process, and they're currently moving the goalposts on it. They've issued some new proposed regulations making it much more difficult for states to do it. I will say two things on that from just my perspective. The first one is it's actually more effective as an anti-drug initiative than it is an anti-fraud initiative. In states that have put photos on their EBT cards, that's Maine, Massachusetts, Missouri's about to do it, and Kansas. There is yet to be a EBT card to show up in a drug raid, even though the ones without photos still do occasionally. The other thing I would acknowledge is that it will cost you more money than it will save you. So if it's a priority of the legislature here in the state to do that, so be it. But the return on investment is not there. Doesn't mean you shouldn't consider it. In fact, there are many things we do in law enforcement areas that we don't ask for return on investment, and this might be one of them, but just to give you that kind of context of where things are trending in the country.
Well, what triggered that question for me, because I had forgotten about it, until when you had the picture up there, had the drug paraphernalia and everything, and the stacks of cards slid out. And that's where it was coming from. Actually, law enforcement has said something to me about it as well. But I was just curious about the expense as well, and you've answered that question, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, and just one more on the expense. It typically costs about $1 a card to do it.
It costs $1 a card.
To put a photo on it.
how's that become cost prohibitive then to do it that way? You said when it costs more than what it's worth if it's only $1 a card.
You typically won't find so many individuals to remove and save on the administrative cost side for states to offset that cost. That has been the experience in other states.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further questions of our presenter? Yes. Vice Chairman Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'd mentioned the fraud-based program you were talking about. You mentioned a West Virginia estimate savings of $20 million. But I was wondering about the work requirement earlier presentation. Do you have a West Virginia estimate on that, or a West Virginia estimate on the dual enrollment or data tracking use? How much that would save in West Virginia, or do you have an estimate on those?
So the answer is kind of. I'd be happy to work with you all. On the food stamp work requirement piece, the state savings is administrative. So the way the food stamp program is set up is there are federal dollars pay for the benefits, and then the state and the federal government split the administrative costs. So any decrease in the amount of individuals that are on that program as a result of the work requirement would decrease, and you'd get 50% of the administrative savings. Don't have those numbers in front of me, but I'm happy to provide them the estimates that we have put together on that. There's also a collateral benefit to the state. It's our estimate based on the experience in other states that about 3,500 of these able-bodied adults without dependents would be doing so much better financially that they would no longer qualify for the Medicaid expansion. And so they would be off that program, so that would result in some state savings as well due to the match rate, especially, and will get bigger as the state share of that Medicaid expansion population goes up over the next few years. And I'm sorry, what was the third?
Well, it was the dual enrollment and the food stamps and the work requirement for TANF, but.
Yep. So for the dual enrollment, the experience that we've seen in those 5 southeastern states, again, it's going to be largely federal savings because it's a federally funded benefit. But the state savings it's usually around 1%, just under 1% is what we've seen in these other states. And we're happy to kind of run that calculation for you all and get you a number.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier $87 million worth of new economic activity for those who don't.
Yep, and about $3 million in increased income tax revenue for the state.
Yeah, if you could put that together for me, that would be helpful in those 3 proposals.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
We'll see that the entire committee gets copies of that. Further questions? Senator Blake?
I thank the co-chair up there because it made me realize another question here. On the work requirement, and you were looking at the numbers back, but how do we factor in, areas that would have high unemployment, there would be no potential for, finding work and things like that?
Sure.
How's that play?
Sure. This is not a unique issue. As you can imagine, a number of these states that have reinstated their work requirement, particularly in some rural areas, although often in more urban areas too. A couple things to consider here. The first one is that in Maine, what they found is actually the areas with the highest unemployment rate is where they saw the highest compliance rate with the work requirement. Completely counter to what we would think. Now, the other thing I would just mention is you can meet the so-called work requirement in many ways. As I mentioned, you can volunteer. And I believe that most communities have great volunteer opportunities. In fact, a couple months ago, I went on the West Virginia, basically the commission that is responsible for volunteer opportunities, and there were great opportunities at food banks and humane societies and others. And you all have had some flooding as a result, and that website has now been turned to looking for volunteers to help with flooding victims. That could meet the work requirement. Going back to school, training. So there's a number of ways to meet that work requirement. And I think what's really important is that if we have fewer people on the program to be servicing, we can actually advise them in a much more personalized way going forward. That you now know, your skill set is not well suited for that opportunity, or it fits really well with manufacturing or agriculture. And by the way, we now know that over the past 2 quarters, that's where most of the hiring has been. Go apply for those kinds of jobs instead of saying, applying for any other job. Really focus in and hone on and trying to get people on the economic ladder as soon as possible. Because the research is very, very clear. The shorter somebody's on the program, easier it is to get them a job. The longer they sit there, much, much more difficult to find them a job. So you want your program to be focused on getting people reattached to the economic ladder as soon as possible.
Do you have a follow-up?
Thank you.
Further questions? Yes, Senator Trump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You talked about states that have switched or restructured the way they do these things, and my question is sort of general. When states do that, do they generally do it by legislative enactment, or are they doing it by changes in department policy, the agencies which administer these programs? And then historically, if you know, in the 20 years since the Federal Welfare Reform Act was passed, has West Virginia changed its approach to these questions?
So the answer to your first question is both. Depends on the state. Sometimes if there's a governor or an agency that really is excited, they might lead on some of these initiatives and the legislature might follow and codify it into practice. In other states, it's the legislature starting and finishing that conversation about the directions ahead. It's probably about 50-50, to be honest, on kind of how that happens. As far as the welfare question and welfare reform, the TANF program was really the focus of that program, and states have a tremendous amount of flexibility on how they structure that program. And so, yeah, I mean, West Virginia has changed things a number of times over the years in the TANF program. I will say one thing, it is a small program. The great success of welfare reform is that there are not many people on that program anymore. There's about 14,000 here in West Virginia on that program. That's a testament to the reform. Whereas by contrast, you look at the food stamp program and the Medicaid program, and you have hundreds of thousands of people on those programs. So while it is important to think through how your TANF programs are structured and your current practice, as far as the big impact is going to be in your state, you really want to be focusing on those other programs first, and then eventually getting probably to your TANF program and reforms there.
I'll take one more question, and then we need to move on to other presenters if there's other questions. All right, if not, thank you so much. It was a very informative presentation. I hope that we can avail ourselves of some of these great ideas.